India's climate strategy is really a power sector strategy. I mean, there are elements of the forests as well, but it's a different story and not a particularly exciting or positive story. But let's stick to the power conversation. Right? What India says it's going to get done by 2030, so in about 9 years from now, is 40% of our total installed capacity of power will come from non-fossil fuel. Now, this is significantly solar, but also wind, hydro, some biomass, nuclear, and so on. And before that, as an interim step, we know by the end of 2022, we have set a target of 175 gigawatts of renewables. And last month, some of you might have noticed India's power minister announcing that we've achieved 100 gigawatts of that 175 that we need to get done next year. Now, reason I'm saying all this is we have one more target, which is to get to 450 gigawatts by 2030. 450 gigawatts of renewables by 2030. The reason I'm saying all this is to say that, look, the destination is very clear and the journey is well underway. Now, of course, we talk about this as India, right? But the transition to clean energy is going to happen in states. And this is important to bear in mind because states in India have different priorities and are at different levels of development, as many of you know. They also have different resources available and opportunities and challenges are not necessarily similar across these different states. So while the national policy and efforts are important, we need to see this through the prism of specific states. In my mind, the way I visualize this is like a railway tracks. So you have two parallel lines. You have the fossil fuel line and you have the renewable line, and they're both headed and both are continuing to sort of go into the distant future. Now, for these to converge, we're going to have to think beyond this renewables versus coal kind of dichotomy. We're going to have to look at other technologies. We're going to have to look at what is the power sector really about? When we say energy sector transition, what is it we're talking about? It's not just the issue of fuels. And like Aarti said, there are many issues that predate this, from utilities, finances, to the lack of reliable power, to poor, supply, and the issues of reliability and resilience will need to be factored in and will continue to be very, very important.
Is it all right to ask you essentially the point at which Bharath ended to say that the transition will only happen better if it is worked into a broader set of economic priorities? And from a very layperson perspective, when you look at the economic priorities, for instance, of key players like DISCOM, the distribution companies in the energy sector, they are hugely financially incapable. They feel like, they are the biggest challenge in the transition because of all the complexities associated with the DISCOMs and many states bleeding. What in your view are the big regulatory challenges which are affecting the sector, and what do you think is really required if change has to be made?
When we're talking of clean energy transition, we should remember that today the bulk of the conversation that's happening is about clean electricity transition, which is really speaking only a small part of the energy transition. Again, something which may not be obvious simply because every time we go to our houses, we switch on a light, we see electricity powering us. If you look at in terms of energy terms, at the end use point, electricity constitutes only 20 to 25% of the energy that's consumed in the country. So about 75 to 80% of the energy that gets consumed in the country is actually not consumed in the form of electricity at all. So if you're talking of energy transition, that is a much bigger question that we need to ask. And there, the really the energy sources that we really need to look at are coal and oil predominantly. There are others too, but predominantly coal, which is used in the industry, not just for electricity generation, but in the industry, and oil, which is significantly used in transport, but also used in industry again. And for these, the transition again is happening, especially for oil and transportation. We are looking at electrification of transport and so on and so forth as a way forward, but it's I would say further down the road as compared to the transition in the electricity sector. So that's, I think, the one point that I wanted to highlight, that while it's good to focus on electricity right now, because that's the transition there is here and now, the bigger picture is really kind of much bigger in some sense. Climate change has helped to focus our attentions on a few problems that have always been there, and of course brought along with it a few new problems to focus our attention on, but it's nonetheless helped to focus our attention on some of these issues in any case. So for example, I mean, it's not as though coal was not problematic if climate change wasn't a problem. I think we had a lot of issues with coal in terms of local environmental pollution, water degradation, biodiversity loss, and so on and so forth. Anyways, the good thing about climate change and the fact that it has spurred the global R&D and the industrial sectors to put in money to find alternatives is that now we have a solution that might hopefully address many of the other problems also. And I completely agree that this is one of those classical wicked multidimensional problems for which, unless we find solutions that also help us as a country and as people to quote unquote use a much maligned word, develop in terms of getting access to energy services, being able to access employment, education, lead fulfilling livelihoods, I think it's going to be very hard to make this transition naturally, because after all, why should people buy into something if it is not going to help them? It is, so if I'm a worker somewhere, or if I'm a student somewhere, or if I'm an employee somewhere, if it's not going to help me, there is going to be a problem. In sense of in how easily I will accept the fact that an energy transition is required. I think Bharath has already mentioned the issue of affordable and reliable access to energy in particular. And since we're talking electricity right now, electricity in particular, and this is where the entire DISCOM tangle comes in. I don't think I want to go into too much of the DISCOM issue here, because it's a very complex issue. We don't want to go into that. But the challenge is that the distribution companies need to reinvent themselves to be able to deal with the new realities that we have as we go forward, both in terms of their business models as well as what their focus should be in terms of who they are providing service to, what kind of service they're providing. But at the same time, of course, there are also issues. It's not as though they're the only, shall we say, culprits in the game. There are challenges from other parts of the value chain in the power sector also, which we need to address.
Well, if you're looking at transition to clean energy, there must be not just the DISCOM approach. There must be a system which makes them much more acceptable. And the reason is, you have a power company which is saying, well, if you want us to get forest clearance, it'll need us more time. It will need consent from the Gram Sabha. It will make such a power company unviable. And I think as of today, if you look at it, the regulatory system in India as it exists, and I can only talk about the environmental regulatory agencies, whether it's the State Impact Assessment Authority, the Forest Advisory Committee, the EAC, none of them are actually geared to look into the problems that arise because of social opposition that is going to come to these projects. And so there's a complete disconnect. So if you look at it here, there is no understanding or appreciation of the challenges that they will face, mainly because something is green, mainly because it is aimed at a lower carbon footprint does not necessarily mean that it is going to be accepted. And I think that is going to push up a lot of costs, increase the risk. And we must work towards, I think, getting new systems in place. And that would mean legal changes, which makes it mandatory to have certain amount of, I would say, community acceptability as well as impact assessment. If you look at all across India, now if you look at even windmills or solar and others, the Supreme Court has now very clearly said in all areas which are the Great Indian Bustard, both existing as well as potential. Potential is a very huge word, Potentially all of India can have tigers, potentially, every place can have many things. Now, but it's the fact is that they've used the word. And now they're saying we'll have it underground. And they're saying, well, underground will make it completely unviable. They may have a point, but there is also a point that why do you set up without understanding or mentioning that there are no endangered species at all. So we need to have, in a way, within the regulatory agencies, a much greater a synergy, a much greater understanding about what are the likely risks, what are the likely challenges, what are the likely opposition, and how do you actually work around it. That's what I have to basically say, and I can add later in it. But I think unless we address it, I don't see the transition happening in the way it's been projected in ground. There are going to be a lot of more hindrance than a linear upward shift that most energy analysts are trying to project.
I want to sort of, I think, underscore what Ritwick said. I think the first thing we need to do, if we are thinking about, as we think of more and more renewables, is that we should agree we won't make the same mistakes we did last time. And those are really that we disregarded environmental and social impacts. We did that in the interest of trying to push rapid growth of the energy sector in the past. We're still paying the prices. Many communities still suffer. And like Ritwick said, there are going to be, you have on the one hand, these lopsided economic arrangements for sharing benefits. We are also going to see more and more conflicts.
Fundamentally, I don't think we should be looking at this whole coal and renewables thing as a black and white thing, or as a kind of good versus bad, or whatever, good versus evil battle kind of a thing. It's much more nuanced than that. And I think there are many examples that highlight this. And we really, as a country, need to find what are these alternatives. And I actually feel that given the kind of complexity of the system that we have and the needs that we're trying to meet, we really need a judicious mix of different kinds of renewables. So it's not necessarily that everything has to be distributed, but it's definitely not true that everything has to be centralized. And it's not even the case that these are the two extremes are the only possibilities. One can even have medium-sized solutions which can actually cater to needs. So for example, a city can set up, let's say, a 1 gigawatt small plant, which doesn't need humongous amounts of land. Or of course, the solar feeder kind of a program which needs a few megawatts. So it's not really rooftop, it's still a few megawatts, but still distributed and close to where the consumption is happening. So one can have a spectrum. I think it's a mistake again to look at this as an either or, distributed or centralized. I think it's also a spectrum, and we really need to see what is that, how much we want to emphasize on which aspect of the spectrum.
Though there is a lot of reports about the community struggle and then using a lot of legal tools and others in order to whether seek compensation or to make the power projects accountable. The matter of fact is, in reality, their capacity is extremely limited. We only say report about those 2% or 0.5% number of instances where people succeed. And there are so many hurdles in actually making power plants and others comply or to make them accountable. So at the long run, I think it has to be a more policy level intervention, and it has to be more driven by political will.
We shouldn't be repeating the mistakes of what we did with the old energy world in the new energy world. I think one of the important or one of the problems that we had with the old energy world was too little competition. And I think with the renewable space, especially the solar space, the good news until recently, perhaps even now to some extent, is that it is a very, very competitive space. We have a lot of players who are actually competing there. The worry is, as you said, whether this will last, or is there going to be a consolidation as it happened with in the mobile phone world and so on? Is there going to be a consolidation as we go forward, that by 2025 or 2026 we end up with 2 or 3 players, and that has its own dangers and risks, and something that we should avoid. And really speaking, I think the only way to do that is having an active citizenry and hopefully an active competition commission that does its job to do that. So, but I think that's a very important element as we move to the new energy world. And the wind energy sector is already pretty concentrated. We need much more competition in the wind energy sector, and the solar energy sector, which was competitive, is moving towards being less competitive, which is not a good sign. And actually, one last point, sorry, Bharath, is that I think the whole issue of centralized versus decentralized versus something in between discussion we had is also helpful from this point of view, that because obviously if you're going to have a very concentrated markets, they would much rather prefer the much bigger parks. It's very unlikely that they would be interested in setting up chota things here and there around the country. So I think so that having that spectrum is also useful to promote competition and having greater number of players, and therefore more innovation, more business models, better prices, etc., etc.
No transition is ever been linear and sort of smooth and so on. I mean, we're talking about significant disruptions to mega companies, and business as it is sort of changing so rapidly. So I've always imagined this is going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 1 step to the left, 3 steps to the right kind of thing. And that's what this transition is already looking like.